Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Speak Up office here in Amsterdam. My name is Robert Greco. I am the legal director here at Speak Up, and I am joined by my colleague Ezekiel Ward. Ezekiel, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about monitoring compliance programs effectively beyond audit and controls. But I'd love to turn it over to Zeke to introduce himself now to the group.
Hi everyone, I'm Zeke. Good morning. Some of you might know me already. I'm a lawyer by background. I'm also a forensic accountant. So started out with PwC and KPMG. I've been chief compliance officer at a couple of multinationals, Yara in Norway and Volvo Group in Sweden. And for the past 6 years, I've run North Star Compliance. So we help legal and compliance teams lifting up any aspect of their compliance program. We offer IDD reports and support on internal investigations. And great to be here today to talk about a really important aspect of the compliance program, which is monitoring.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into the conversation. And I think maybe we should kick it off by discussing why is it worth identifying monitoring in this type of forum as important for discussion?
Right. So I think off the bat, we can say that monitoring is under discussed. I mean, even the order in which it's placed in the official guidance from the SEC and DOJ, it's like number 15 of 15. So it's an under-discussed topic. It's clearly a gap in many compliance programs, and you might be doing parts of it in a way, but there are other parts that are definitely not focused on as perhaps they should be, and as I'll be advocating for today. Secondly, I think it's a really great way of elevating your compliance program. It's an easy way of gaining some efficiencies. And essentially, what we'll be talking about in a bit is pushing a lot of the controls into the line management, into the business itself, and lifting the compliance program up to focus on monitoring.
And I think that's a great segue into our first official question, which is, what do we mean by monitoring in this context?
Right. So there are a couple of ways of dealing with looking at monitoring. The first one is my program designed effectively? And secondly, is it operating efficiently? And the first question is fairly basic. It's kind of taking that view, looking in the mirror and looking at how the program is designed. The second question on operations is much more complicated. So, you need to ask 3 sub-questions there. Number 1, have I implemented the controls that I wanted to implement? Number 2, completeness. Do my controls actually see everything they should see? And number 3, which is the really tough one, is around quality. So trying to make sure that the controls you've got in place, which are complete across the whole organization, are actually done to a sufficient standard. So that's monitoring in a nutshell. I think we can take a couple of examples there. Whistleblowing is an obvious one, where you would want to look at the design of the program, what policies and procedures you want to have in place, what's the ambition for those, what's the ambition for the tools, what are the risks, what are the legal and regulatory expectations, and just looking at all of those factors and saying, have we designed a whistleblowing function that is fit for purpose? And then to move on to the second question, you'd say, okay, so that's the ambition state. What do I think about how that operates in reality and day to day? So that first question that we talked about, have I implemented controls? Look at the tool. Is it implemented properly? Are there controls within that tool that you really need to be working well? So segregation of duty, access rights, privacy and security, all of those sorts of things. So is it actually implemented? And you could look at implementation from a much broader perspective as well. You could start thinking about tone at the top and public statements on the importance of speak up for employees and for the culture of an organization. Then moving on to completeness, the question is, have you implemented that control everywhere? Does it see everything? So is the whistleblowing tool actually reaching all parts of the organization? And the really hard bit at the end is quality. So looking at probably some individual cases, maybe on a sample basis, and saying, okay, did that come in the right way as we wanted it to? Was the report clear enough as we would like a reporter to or a whistleblower to approach us in that kind of manner? And how did we deal with it? Did we meet the requirements from the law, from the EU whistleblowing directive, for example? Did we handle and assign the case the way we wanted to? And then I always talk about closing the loop, but did we take the lessons and learn from the case as we should have done as an organization? So for me, that's some shape of monitoring as I would define it.
I think that sets the table really excellently for the balance of the conversation. But if I could, I'd love to ask a few follow-on questions on two of the elements,
Sure.
specifically around completeness and quality, because I think that everybody in a compliance function is looking to build a fit-for-purpose policy and program, but sometimes it's a little bit challenging to understand what the broadest reaches of your organization needs in order for it to be fit for purpose. So from a completeness standpoint, where do you think blind spots are easiest to arise? And as a follow-on to that, when you are assessing quality in something that doesn't necessarily get measured easily through a standard KPI, the way that perhaps you could identify how marketing engagement is working or whether or not a sales organization is meeting their numbers. Yeah. So how would you give, what would you give to compliance leaders as a frame of reference to consider how to always be striving for better completeness and higher quality?
Yeah, so on the completeness point, you've got to look at what your business actually does in terms of business lines, in terms of products, in terms of geographical spread, and essentially check through that, okay, we do reach all of those. There might be blind spots that are there by design. I mean, a joint venture might be an area that you can't reach into, but if you're going to make proclamations on, well, we take whistleblowing very seriously, then that's also got to be taken seriously in that joint venture. So although it might be a blind spot for the tool, just making sure that it is covered by someone somehow is really, really important. So completeness on all those metrics can be obtained. Quality is so difficult that you've got to, I think, take samples. And there are a few ways in which you're going to be able to adopt a data-driven approach for this. You will have some metrics on case intake, substantiation rates, handling times, those sorts of things. But I think to really get into why or whether a report has been well handled according to the process you've designed, you're going to have to go into those cases. And an area that if I were a chief compliance officer in a multinational, again, I would be really focusing on would be something like retaliation, because it's such a legal risk. It's such an exposure for an organization. And it's such a, dare I say, a moral duty to take care of that risk, that you need to go into those individual cases and as the CCO really understand, why is this occurring? What can we do to prevent that from happening again?
And on that point, and I know that sometimes in data-driven organizations and in an increasingly data-driven society, we sometimes shy away from subjective analysis.
Right.
In this context, do you think that subjective analysis still plays a role so that you can drive quality into sort of the furthest reaches of the organization and to assess that quality and to be able to communicate how successful you've been throughout your organization?
Yeah, so I think subjective analysis is really important, and we're not talking about anecdotes.
Right.
We're moving beyond that into real analysis. And one of the ways in which it's valuable, I think, is that you, when you're doing this monitoring exercise, is that you're reaching into a very unique case and a unique set of circumstances where actually it deserves that kind of substantive and subjective analysis. So I think it's well worth taking the time to go into those samples, take the learnings, really understand the case, and feed those back into your program to make improvements.
Well, as a fellow lawyer, I like the "it depends" answer, right? And I think that it makes a lot of sense in this context. So thank you very much for that. I think we'll pause the conversation. We've got an interesting poll for the viewers that we'd love to get your opinion on. And I think that it should be coming up on your screens now. And the question is, how confident are you that your compliance program is actively monitored today? And then we have a number of points here on very confident, somewhat confident, not confident, or just not sure at all. And I guess from Zeke's perspective, where do you think that this is going to land?
I'm not going to make any predictions,
Okay.
but it's really interesting to see the results coming in, and what a nice split between the answers at the moment. I think levels of confidence are going to differ depending on your perspective. I think if you're someone that is working actively with monitoring, then you're probably going to have a higher level of confidence. But if you see only a smaller slice of the pie, it might be difficult to say, yeah, we've got a handle on this. I think as you're looking at that question, one of the massive distinctions here is between controls on the one hand and monitoring of those controls on the other. So, to take another example of a conflict of interest declaration, that's the control, and the line manager review is looking at whether that control has been done properly. The monitoring is one level up. Has the control been done? Has it been done completely? And is it done to a sufficient quality? So this huge distinction between controls and monitoring.
Very interesting. And I think that it dovetails nicely into the next question that we have for discussion. And perhaps it can be tied into the confidence responses that we've received.
Right.
In that if we are making if we're positing a thesis that confidence may be tied to monitoring, why is monitoring overlooked if perhaps we don't have the strength of confidence that our compliance program is working?
Yeah, I think monitoring is overlooked for a few equally valid reasons. And number one, just talking about controls and monitoring, I think we get bogged down in implementation much of the time. I think there's so much to do, there's so much in the day-to-day that we want to focus on, that monitoring sort of takes a back seat. So that day-to-day work of training, of case handling, of investigations, that all takes over. I think secondly, there are some misunderstandings, and certainly when I started out as a CCO, I said to myself, okay, monitoring, right at the end, element number 15, I'll not take a strong view on it. And by the way, we have an internal audit department, and that's enough. And, I think today, categorically, that's not enough. Yes, internal audit plays a role, but it's very much in that third line. Compliance is almost always a second line function, and compliance itself has to look in the mirror and say, is my program designed effectively? Is it operating efficiently? So there's that misunderstanding is a clear second point.
Can I stop you there?
Absolutely.
Ask a question.
Sure.
So do you feel as though in many compliance programs and organizations that there's an over-reliance on an internal audit function to play that monitoring role, when internal audit isn't necessarily focused on monitoring compliance outcomes specifically?
Right. So I think internal audit has a lot of different priorities, a lot of strategic level priorities from the board of directors. And it's going to be very, very difficult for internal audit to take that kind of expert view on the compliance program that the compliance officers themselves can take. They probably have some access to other data, which is nice to kind of complement your own monitoring activities. But I would say the right people to do the job of monitoring sit within the compliance function.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And just to move on to the, another reason why this might be overlooked is that I don't think regulators are particularly focused on it. If you read the guidance from the UK Ministry of Justice or the SEC and the DOJ, they're rather high level kind of principles and outcomes focused guidances. The one which does catch the eye is on Sapin 2 from the AFA in France. At least that guidance does make a distinction between the design of the program and how it's operating. Of course, it could go a lot deeper, but I think the French guidance is quite impressive in that regard.
And why do you think that France specifically has focused on that differentiation and trying to bring a little bit more specificity to the understanding of what monitoring could be?
Yeah, I think France took maybe a little bit more time over bringing these regulations into play, and certainly took a lot of criticism and had to field a lot of foreign enforcement of large multinationals for that. But the legislative framework and the guidance which has come in in my view, is fairly robust.
Okay.
It's certainly perhaps a more academic approach to anti-corruption compliance programs, and is overall quite impressive. I mean, the fact that the regulator will come and check and actually have that direct discussion with large companies about how the program is being implemented, I think is deeply impressive. And I was lucky enough to field one of the very first reviews in that regard from the AFA. So yeah, I think they've taken their time and they've got a really solid approach.
And from the perspective of this being still a very academic exercise in the creation of these regulations, do you anticipate that perhaps the AFA's approach could form the basis of some kind of broader EU regulation? Or do you think that perhaps because it may be slightly too academic in this early stage, that some additional insight from commercial operation and entities will come in and perhaps steer the eventual European regulation in a slightly different direction?
You definitely see that difference in approach between the jurisdictions, and France sits roughly alone in its approach for a reason. It is more time consuming to do it that way. But I think what it could encourage is maybe boards of directors to take more active consideration of monitoring. Maybe internal auditors would like to step a little bit more into that zone if they wish, and if they want to put a focus on compliance for a year or 2 years, then that's a great way of doing it. But all of this is very data driven. It's very process driven as well, and I think that to go back to your original question about why monitoring is overlooked, there are lots of steps before you get to do good monitoring that you need to complete, and that's about having the right data collection and having the right processes in place, so that when you're asking the questions about the design and when you're asking questions about the operational efficiency, you've got good structures to kind of hang your hat on. If you don't have the data and if you don't have the processes, you actually can't really ask the questions that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think that that's fair. I think that if you don't have a particularly good starting point, then it's going to be really challenging for you to build from nothing.
Indeed,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So that brings us to an excellent opportunity to ask our second question and to bring another poll up in front of our viewers. Which part of monitoring is the hardest for your team today? Is it implementation, completeness, quality, or is it simply that we're not monitoring actively? And we'll see the numbers come up in front of us now. And we had excellent participation in the first poll, and the feedback is extremely helpful to guide us as to where to take the conversation next, both during this webinar and also in future webinars when we hope to host Zeke again in our offices.
Fantastic. Well, you can see a really good response again to this one. And I am not overly surprised by the completeness aspect.
Okay.
Quality is very, very hard to achieve in terms of not having data-driven ways of getting insights there. But completeness is difficult, especially in, say, a decentralized organization.
Yeah.
Very, very hard to say, I'm going to reach everyone if, maybe even the ERP system isn't centralized. Then you've got some more basic problems to handle before you get onto really good completeness of monitoring.
Yeah, and I think that the decentralization issue is something that a number of our viewers are likely faced with, considering that we have a number of multinational organizations that are joining us today, and it's not always possible to know everything that's happening everywhere. And certainly, and I think we'll get into it a little bit later in the conversation, having people in the business that are acting almost as a first line of defense is going to be key in order for you to drive the efficacy of any program. Right. Certainly one, if you're working for an entity that's operating in 80 or 90 different jurisdictions.
Totally. So I think to that point, another example is really helpful around conflicts of interest. Getting employees to complete the declaration, and depending on your scope, getting everyone in scope to complete the declaration is hard.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? You just look at e-learning completion rates. If you get to 90, that's pretty good. So with conflicts of interest, ideally you want to get to 100% of your scope, and very, very challenging to achieve that.
And do you think that it's challenging to achieve that because it's challenging to identify the value that it brings to the organization and to comprehensively explain that to people in various jurisdictions where culturally perhaps things may work a little bit differently? Or is there some other element where you see organizations are failing to really push that culture through?
Yeah, there are loads of reasons why you're not able to reach into certain parts of the organization. Just a sheer physical distance away from them, organizational distance, and kind of a separate feeling of a separate entity or organization within that part of the multinational. But there could be all sorts of reasons why, for example, people don't want to fill in a conflicts of interest declaration form
Because they have a conflict.
because they have a conflict,
Yeah.
or because they feel like, okay, that's too much. You're reaching into some topics there which are really difficult for me to talk about in the workplace. So conflicts are all about your family, friends, close associates, and that's where the conflict comes from. A business has many rights to try to control those conflicts, but it by no means is a sort of seal of approval to do what you want with the employee's conflict of interest.
Certainly, and I think it's very challenging to get your arms around it, and every sort of additional 10 or 20,000 employees you add to that list, it just becomes that much more complicated and myriad of a problem to solve. But bringing us back to the broader conversation, thank you again for all of your responses to the poll. We've touched on it a little bit, but maybe we can get deeper into the issue of why monitoring matters ultimately.
Sure. We've talked about how regulators approach this, and no matter if that is high level and quite principles based, it is still an expectation. So if you do get yourself into an enforcement action, I think data and documentation around monitoring is a wonderful way of showing control and showing, whatever you want to call it, adequate procedures. So it is expected from regulators, regardless of their high-level pronouncements on it. I think essentially this shifts compliance up one level. It says, hey, here are the controls, and employees, line managers, we trust you to handle those controls. You're closest to the business. You're
Certainly
closest to all these operational realities. You need to drive the due diligence on business partners, conflicts of interest, culture building, and the speak up culture, which we want to get built up in an organization. You're closest to those, so you handle it as a business. And what we're going to do as a compliance function is really just report on the delta between an ambition state and the reality of what you're reporting into me. Now, I think initially that can be quite an uncomfortable position to be in. If you think about going to the board of directors and saying, okay, so we set a policy, we set this ambition state, and we've said in that policy it's the line management's responsibility. And here's the reality, here's the monitoring results. Only 20% has been completed. I think there has to be a maturity from the board and from the compliance function to say, okay, well, it was the line management's responsibility. Thank you very much for reporting in these statistics, and we hope to see an improvement next time, and lend their support as a board to getting this driven through. So if you've got a supportive board, I think that approach can really, really work well, at the same time as keeping the compliance organization quite lean. It doesn't take too many resources if you're going to put the controls into the line management and monitor them. There are 100 different conversations we can have about whether that is plausible, realistic, what the reaction of the business is going to be, what the reaction of the board is going to be. But those are other conversations. I think the theoretical design of that approach, controls in the line and monitoring by compliance, is a really, really sound starting point.
And what sort of experience, positive or negative, have you had in either implementing this theoretical design or advising your clients in your consulting practice to implement this type of theoretical design?
Look, I think if you get the design right, I think this is perfectly workable.
Okay.
So one of the things is to make sure that you road test and calibrate your ambition state, and maybe phase it in over time. But if you've road tested it, calibrated the policy, then the reality hopefully isn't too much of a leap for the business to achieve. Some examples would be on conflicts of interest, where we've taken a risk-based approach and said everyone above a certain level, everyone in this risk-exposed function, such as procurement,
Definitely.
they can complete conflicts of interest declarations. That's workable.
Yeah.
I think that's realistic. If you take the approach of, okay, everyone's going to do it and they're going to do it every 6 months,
Right.
then we're going to have huge deltas. You're going to have great big pushback from the line organization, and it's unworkable.
Yeah, and I think that's the part where maybe it becomes challenging for me to see the efficacy of that approach, because if you're working with a line that is very focused on driving value for the organization in a specific fashion, oftentimes any additional element or piece of work that they're expected to do that isn't directly related to driving that value is seen as something that is not really worth taking on.
Yeah.
So how is it that we can show the value for the organization as a whole, and by extension, how that value then comes back to each line?
I would say start with one topic. So if you're going to adopt this monitoring approach, start with something that's really tangible. I think conflicts of interest are a good one. Whistleblowing is another good one. But if you can demonstrate the value of the conversation using this monitoring approach in conflicts of interest, then you can expand it over time to other areas of your program. And conflicts are really, really damaging things. They're often a risk on which we have little data in many organizations. So it's a great starting point, because it also slowly lifts the lid on a can of worms that does need dealing with. And as I say, it's tangible enough that leaders are going to see the value. You're going to have way better conversations with those leaders after getting into this monitoring approach. And if you can play out how those conversations go before and after a monitoring approach, beforehand it goes something like, hey, conflict of interest, we think they're a risk, we think they might be a risk in these parts of the organization. Maybe we've seen one or two cases. It's not particularly data driven. It's a little bit kind of theoretical.
Right.
After monitoring, you're saying, okay, we scoped out 700 employees, all of them completed a conflict of interest declaration form. We had 30 high-risk declarations. They were all focused on this process or this part of the business. Therefore, we're going to throw an absolute load of effort next year on training that part of the organization. How much more concrete is that? And all of that is enabled by a robust monitoring approach.
And I would imagine that needs to very much be underpinned by a tone from the top. And that top has to be at the C-suite level and the board. Or is that something that, the compliance officer also needs to work sort of up and down at the same time in order to build that culture so that it feels organic?
Yeah, I don't want to leave that undiscussed, actually, because it's really important to say, look, we can say this in a studio and talk about
of course.
these theoretical great things. But as I said in a previous answer, you have to have a supportive board. I think supporting the C-suite is really, really important. And so as you're approaching this, you've got to line up those supporters in the right way and get them to see the value before you've done it. That's a tough conversation. But you need the support. Otherwise, this could be a difficult sell.
Yeah, I think we've all been there before. Right. Certainly the majority of people watching today, and I know I have. So definitely, it's not always easy. But when you can pull it off, I think that the results speak for themselves. Definitely. Right. So I think that pulls us into our final poll that hopefully we can have brought up here. And it's a question on where is monitoring most needed in your programs today. Is it whistleblowing? We've talked quite a bit about conflict of interest as well. Is it general training? Is it case handling? Third-party due diligence? Broader program oversight, just generally? Or are you not really sure yet where you need to be focusing for the future?
Yeah. And it could be that some programs need that helicopter view first of all before they dive into a particular topic. All the forms here are, I would say, equally valid starting points as well. If you were thinking about taking that kind of phased approach, or building up the idea of moving into a monitoring approach with your stakeholders. So
what would be the bedrock for you if you were starting in an organization, there was no real program in place? Could be a small organization, could be a large organization that maybe didn't prioritize this.
Yeah.
If you were starting of these, where would you be looking to focus?
So I think when I started at Yara, certainly the policy framework needed to be in place.
Okay.
There was an ethics handbook. We wanted to have let's say a more strict code of conduct in place. And so getting that there, getting the policies around that code of conduct, really important. And just a small tangent on that, my own sort of dislike of multiple policies and procedures is quite strong. Some organizations have dozens and dozens of compliance documents.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if your lawyers and your compliance officers are not reading those, your employees are definitely not reading those.
Agreed. Fully agreed.
So one option is to have either the code of conduct as a one-stop shop with simple, clear policies within them. You can even include some policy limits, thresholds around gifts and hospitality, for example. Yeah. Or you can have a straightforward, more traditional code of conduct,
right,
and an ethics and compliance directive that sits very close to that. Either way, it's a one-stop shop so that employees can use it as a reference point. So your policies are probably that first starting point. And then I think the risk assessment, I mean, you're essentially following those 15 elements of a compliance program that we see in lots of guidance. And you're getting the culture and the tone at the top, you're getting the risk assessment in place, and then you're looking at, well, what kind of policies and procedures should I put in place here as well? So those are some of the foundations. I really like the broader program oversight here because you're looking in the mirror. And you really have to challenge yourself. Am I doing the right things? Have I designed this the right way? But look, I mean, I see the answers here on conflicts of interest are pretty numerous.
Pretty high, yeah.
Pretty high there, and third-party due diligence.
Also.
And this is about risk, right? So conflicts of interest, massive risk internally and externally. And third-party due diligence, I mean, your business partners, so uncontrollable.
Absolutely.
And one of your biggest risks.
Very interesting responses. And we see again that we have a pretty broad distribution of the answers. Thank you again for participating with us. So Zeke, as we sort of round into the final 10 minutes or so of our chat today before we move into questions and answers, how are we actually looking to do this? Like, what should people be walking away from this presentation thinking about dealing with monitoring?
Right. I think it's helpful just to go back to the questions at the start, because they are so practical. You know, when you asked me what is monitoring, I responded with about 5 different questions of my own. So that's a definition, if you like.
Right.
And those questions were, is the compliance program designed in the way that we want it to? What's your ambition state? And there, it does help, even in a crisis company, a crisis situation. It really does help to have this clarity of what's the end state. Where am I driving with this? In which order am I prioritizing those different elements? Like I said about the code of conduct at Yara. So that's the opening question. What's my ambition state? Is it designed well enough? And then when you're able to, getting into those operational questions, and we said, is the compliance program operating efficiently? By which we mean, have I implemented these controls? Do the controls see everything they shall? And are they done to a sufficient quality? So that's just to take it back to that original question and how we achieve it. As I said, I think this elevates compliance, allows you to do a lot more, pushing the controls into the line. I think that's a great takeaway from this if you're looking at doing it. And maybe another thought would be around choosing the technology that you use quite carefully. We saw the answer in that prior poll on business partner due diligence and trying to monitor that. In order to monitor your due diligence on business partners, there are so many things that you have to have in place first. You need the policies and procedures, you need your risk assessment, you need the due diligence platform or tool to be able to feed those new suppliers, existing suppliers, other business partners, including customers, into the tool and complete due diligence in as efficient and thorough manner as possible. It's only then that you can start to do your monitoring, because you've got data, you've got actual cases to look at. So there's a huge amount of work before you get to do the monitoring.
And I think that it goes back to your point about needing to rely closely on your lines of business. And in this context, certainly procurement will play a strong role. But also, I think in a lot of cases, I know here at Speak Up, one of the areas we spend a lot of time dealing with new clients on is security assessments,
Right.
is trying to determine whether or not information is going to be held securely because of how sensitive the information that we hold on our platform will be.
Yeah.
Do you think that companies are thinking robustly enough about how to do their third-party due diligence so that perhaps it extends beyond what are some of the more traditional security and information thresholds that need to be surpassed in order to be a trusted vendor?
Yeah, due diligence on business partners is really, really hard to get right, because the volumes are so huge that you have to make some fairly bold risk decisions.
Right.
You cannot do everything, unless the promised land of AI arrives tomorrow. Maybe it will. Then we can do a lot more. But for now, you're going to have to really decide. What do we trust our colleagues in line management to handle day to day? And that's your standard suppliers in relatively safe jurisdictions. And then what are the thresholds on which I actually do some due diligence? Obviously, first on any compliance officer's lists, all intermediaries, any agents, any commission earners, maybe dealers and distributors. Those go in there. High-risk jurisdictions, thresholds monetary-wise, and then known red flags. And that can be anything from unusual payment requests to some unclear findings in the course of handling that business partner's onboarding. So those are the triggers. And then, as I've said, getting the system in place, getting that right is really, really hard. To all of the other questions around security, privacy, it's got to be baked into a tool. And some of the tools out there are fantastic at handling that, so that the compliance officers and general counsel and their team can focus on what they're really, really good at.
Is there anything else that you feel would be valid for the conversation here before we turn it over to question and answer?
Yeah, I mean, just thinking out loud now about how you might use complementary data sets that are out
Very
there in your organization.
Yeah.
If you're going to do monitoring, don't limit yourself to the data that you collect yourselves. I mean, why not look to the finance function? If you've got an ICFR or internal controls function, use them. I mean, for example, if you find a fraud is being reported through your whistleblowing hotline, question whether it's also being picked up by financial controls. If not, why not? And then flip that question around. If the internal controls are suggesting that there's a risk or an indication of fraud in a part of the organization, why isn't anyone talking about it either within line management or through the Speak Up tools? And that's a great example of monitoring working both ways, improving the financial controls and improving your Speak Up culture.
And in order to align those two programs that potentially run in parallel but need to find a perpendicular crossing,
Right.
How does one in a compliance officer role sort of bridge those two spaces?
A lot on personalities.
Okay.
I think putting politics aside, putting any kind of hierarchical thoughts as I say, politics aside, and just focusing on the subject matter and making it work right. I mean, there are going to be loads of intersections between compliance and other teams, and that's why there are so many of these sorts of webinars where we talk about, what should the right positioning be? What's the relationship between legal and compliance, compliance and audit, compliance and finance? Yeah, that comes up all of the time. And I think all of that has to be put to one side and just say, what's the risk? How can we handle it in terms of policies and procedures, in terms of systems and processes, and then getting eventually to this great tool that we've got in front of us of monitoring. That's a really much more comfortable place to sit for lots of compliance teams.
I love that you use the term politics, because I think that it's an elephant that sits in a lot of rooms that we don't necessarily talk about in the context of operating a compliance team or operating a legal team.
Right.
And oftentimes there are fiefdoms that do arise in any large-scale organization where it can be challenging for that intersection to arise in an organic fashion.
Yeah.
So in your experience, what are some of the ways from a compliance officer standpoint that you can actively work to create more opportunity for that intersection so that you don't need to rely on it in an emergency situation, but rather that it's happening on an ongoing basis?
And the closing of your question is really, really important. So laying up all of these things, all of these good relationships before something happens, because you can't build a friendship or a good level of trust if you're in the middle of a crisis. It's really difficult to do that. So why not build it up way in advance? Have nice, easy conversations about, hey, what's your view on this? What's your view on that? How would you approach this area of risk? And I think in doing that, you build that level of comfort and trust to demonstrate to one another that, okay, we probably think quite alike on this. And if we don't think alike, we know where the points of friction are going to be, and we can carefully steer around them if something bad does happen.
I think the proactive approach in so many situations is the best way to go, and it's the way to really build a resilient organization to deal with invariably the issues that will arise and will challenge all aspects of risk within your organization. So I think that we're going to move into the question and answer period of our presentation, and we do have a question now from Sana. Do you have advice on what tool you use for third-party due diligence? And this is now where Zeke gets to plug, and he gets a commission, and then he has to also disclose conflict of interest. It's perfect. It works really well for our presentation.
I'd like to declare multiple conflicts of interest on this point. Look, I wouldn't like to make sort of public pronouncements on exactly which tools. There are some great ones out there, and there are some less good tools on the market. I think some of the newer tools have a great benefit over legacy tools in that they're not hindered by legacy ways of working. They've been able to develop completely fresh. And I know that some of the older platforms have actually taken the time to rebuild from scratch all of their processes and their workflows. I think when it's coming to third-party due diligence tools, you've got to start your process right. And a lot of people start with kind of looking at what the tools can do. And actually, you need to go one step back. Do you have your policy clear? Exactly what is going to go into that tool? What is your understanding and definition of an agent or an intermediary, for example? What's your understanding of which suppliers do we want to do a serious level of due diligence on? So getting that policy in place is one thing. And then having your own view of the workflows within the tool. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Just set it out on a piece of paper of this person is the one who actually accesses the tool. This person is the one who completes the intake form. Now, already just in those first two blocks of the workflow, you start to see some questions. Okay, if they're going to access the tool, do they have access? Is it a web-based platform? Is it some kind of app? Those are informing your RFP for when you actually go to market and buy a due diligence tool. So it's a great question. I'm not going to drop any names, but plenty of thoughts on how you get that right when it comes down to it.
Oh, yes. Here we go. We're into AI. It was the second question, not the first question this time.
Yeah.
In the era of AI, what are the opportunities and challenges in compliance monitoring to validate completeness and effectiveness? And I do think that that's a really pertinent question because AI could be used in that context already relatively straightforward fashion.
Indeed. Yeah, wonderful question. So starting point is any larger data sets where subjective and individual sort of case-by-case review isn't possible, then let's get AI and let's see what it can do. In terms of completeness, AI is going to have to be fed, or whatever tool you're using is going to have an understanding of what completeness is. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean for you? Is it all of these legal entities? Is it all of these jurisdictions? Is it some sort of master data set on employee or head counts? So you're going to have to teach it what you mean by completeness first of all. But if you can do that effectively, I think it's a great question to ask an AI tool. Mm-hmm. What you're probably more talking about here, though, is automated analytics rather than AI. I don't know exactly the ins and outs or the nuances of this question, but you can automate lots of analytics to get comfort over completeness. Mm-hmm. And certainly, we mentioned the headcount one. You can have a constant check on the master data from HR versus a control which is to be applied to every single employee, like a conflict of interest declaration, for example. You can have that running every second of every day. The harder one is around quality and effectiveness. I mean, AI could take a view on it. Again, you're going to have to teach it what that means, what is high quality. Some of the automations you can do around that, very simply put, things like character counts. I've seen answers to conflict of interest questions where we say, look, if I've asked you for the name of the equities which you've bought, when you bought them, their value at that date, then the ISIN number, for example. If I ask for that and you've answered in fewer than 10 characters, then I know your answer is not complete. So there's my first priority list. I just take all the answers with fewer than 10 characters. So there's some automated ways of doing this as well. In short, I think we're talking about automated analytics a lot more than we realize. And when it's AI, we need to teach it what we mean by completeness and effectiveness.
We have a question from Michael. How can compliance teams get the board more involved or interested in monitoring without overwhelming them?
Right.
It's a great question because sometimes you have all of 30 seconds to get them involved.
Right. Right. So I think that you can present this as a more simple way of viewing the compliance program. Let's imagine you've got 15 elements in your compliance program, everything from tone at the top to due diligence, other controls, and monitoring as element number 15. I think what you could do is say, okay, we're not going to go into the absolute detail of every single element. Instead, I'll just present you with the delta for each element. What was the ambition state? Very simply put, 1 or 2 sentences. Maybe you can put some data on that. Maybe there's a numerical KPI such as 100% of active business partners have a due diligence, a valid approved due diligence in place. Mm-hmm. There's an easy ambition state, right? And then put the reality next to that. And the board, instead of being overwhelmed, might find that extremely refreshing. It's better than traffic lights. You're not saying, well, this is good, okay, or bad. You're actually saying, well, here's the KPI and here's the reality. Mm-hmm. The delta is, let's imagine 40%. Okay, what should we do about this as an organization? And hopefully, the president, usually the CEO, often sitting in the board itself, is going to say, I want that delta to be closed very, very quickly. So
I don't know that I've ever sat with somebody who identified an issue with the traffic light
presentation
style in the way that I also have a problem with the traffic light presentation style. I think that it's definitely overdone. And this is a really wonderful way to rethink how to present that. And certainly after the entirety of our conversation, I think that everybody here has come to expect that you're only providing the group with very thoughtful insight into the space. So thank you very much, Zeke, for joining us today. I wish that we had time for some additional questions, but unfortunately, this brings us to the end of our presentation for today. we would very much like to receive feedback from all of our viewers today, and if at all possible, provide us insight into how we can bring you additional topics of information that are going to be pertinent to your business, but also how we can improve and how we can somehow get Zeke to come and join us again for another conversation. If you are providing us with feedback, we would be happy to provide you with a recording of today's webinar so that you can take that with you and refer back to Zeke's comments. We would also invite you to visit speakup.com for all of our up-to-date content across multiple platforms. Again, my name is Robert Greco. I'm the legal director here for Speak Up, and I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation with Ezekiel Ward. Thank you again, Zeke, and we look forward to seeing you all again, and certainly Zeke again in the near future.
Thanks for having me.